Welcome to the IEU's March Learning Talk, everyone. As some of you may know, the IEU has been organizing a learning talk on a monthly basis, to facilitate this dialogue and information sharing and knowledge sharing. And recently we had learning talks on various and relevant topics such as climate risks and RPSP and some others. And so this month, in recognition and celebration of International Women's Day, which we celebrated on March 8th earlier this month, we decided to dedicate this learning talk to the topic of gender equality and women's empowerment. And on the day of, International Women's Day, I know in this very room, we had a panel discussion on climate technology and innovation organized by the women at GCF. So I really enjoyed that panel discussion myself as just an attendee. And we are very happy that we get to talk about this topic again in our IEU Learning Talk. So as you guys know, women's empowerment is often proposed as a solution to tackle gender inequality, as well as to achieve other development outcomes. A study on women's economic empowerment showed that efforts to promote women's economic capabilities tend to be more effective when they explicitly address women's needs, responsibilities, and constraints. And that is why relevant stakeholders involved in climate action and development should first acknowledge gender-related constraints, and then rigorously adopt gender-responsive and gender-transformative approaches, thereby addressing the root causes of inequality and avoiding further exacerbation of harmful impacts by climate change. And as you know, the GCF's gender policy was adopted in 2019, and the policy acknowledges that climate change initiatives are more sustainable, equitable, and more likely to achieve their objectives when gender equality and women's empowerment considerations are fully integrated into the design and implementation of projects. So now we can go to the program slide. This learning talk is a small step in this direction. In today's talk, our speakers will introduce the findings of a recently concluded evidence review on the interventions that seek to promote women's empowerment in developing countries. Moreover, the speakers will discuss how life skills training is a promising approach to support women's empowerment in climate and agricultural projects. So as you see in the program slide, so after my introduction, I will hand it over to our esteemed colleague from IFAD, Emily Wild, who is a senior technical specialist focusing on social inclusion, poverty targeting from the Environment, Climate, Gender, and Social Inclusion Division at IFAD. And then we will hand it over to my IEU colleague, Dr. Martin Prowse, evaluation specialist. And they too will talk about the evidence gap map and also systematic review on the topic of women's empowerment. And then we will move to a Q&A, and I look forward to getting your questions, interesting questions and comments in this segment, and we will wrap up at the end. So now we can move to the next slide. All right, so here we go. We would like to present the IEU's evidence review on the empowerment of women in developing countries. And this evidence review, by the way, was concluded together with IFAD and Campbell collaboration. Okay, next slide, please. So just a little bit about the evidence reviews that the IEU conducts here. The Independent Evaluation Unit's evidence reviews, they assemble, collect global evidence on topics that are relevant to the Green Climate Fund policies and practices. Since 2018, we have produced a range of evidence gap maps and systematic reviews, and you can get to our website, especially the page that lists all our completed and ongoing evidence reviews. And as you could see from the screen, we did an evidence gap map on forestry, adaptation, private sector investments in mitigation, results-based payments, transformational change, and so on. So please feel free to check out our webpage. And then you're welcome to use these resources, evidence reviews and systematic reviews on very relevant topics in climate and development. With that, I am now ready to hand it over to our first speaker, Ms. Emily Wild, Senior Technical Specialist from IFAD. So Emily, over to you.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon to everyone. It's morning here. I'm dialing in from Abidjan, and it's just a pleasure to be able to be here on behalf of IFAD. So yeah, I'll go through the evidence gap map portion of this. And the EGM, the point of it was to create a visual mapping of what evidence there is on the effectiveness of interventions for empowering women. So this included a typology of interventions and anticipated outcomes from these interventions, and we'll go through those next. Evaluations of interventions to increase women's empowerment, and then including filters on population, intervention, and outcomes. So this PICOS bit is the population intervention comparison outcomes and study designs that we were limited the range of what was included. So the population was girls and women of any age in lower middle income countries, developing countries. So although the focus is on empowerment of women and girls, the target group could also, of course, include men and boys of any age in terms of what the interventions who they focused on. And the interventions themselves were those that were intended to increase women's empowerment. The types of comparison that were included were experimental and non-experimental studies aiming to evaluate the effect of an intervention on the outcomes by using either valid comparison groups or adjusting some kind of adjustment for selection bias. And then the outcomes were self-empowerment, social empowerment, political empowerment, and economic empowerment, and then additional subcategories within those. And then finally, the S is the study designs, which included impact evaluations, process evaluations, and systematic reviews. So next slide. So this is the theory of change that was used, and it looks like a lot on the screen, but the message that's coming through basically is in those orange and yellow boxes towards the left-hand side are the interventions or the pathways, these sort of 5 pathways that either singly or together combined work to increase agency and resources. And so these include policy and institutional pathways, legislation, gender-based budgeting, these kind of things, access to justice. And then there's capacity building, which could include life skills training or technical or vocational training, basically any kind of trainings, support to civil societies and community organizations, so working more at that local organizational level, and the sort of support that those offer, savings groups, other cooperatives, etc. And then specifically economic interventions, cash transfers or asset transfers, business support, employment support, etc. And finally, gender awareness activities for social and behavioral change, whether it's school-based or at the family or community level or media campaigns, any of those social and behavioral change aspects. And so the relative impact of the achievement across these dimensions into the green then, around self-empowerment, social empowerment, economic empowerment, and political empowerment. So again, there's then a range of indicators under all of these outcomes that were looked at separately, but under these 4 main headings. But of course, the relative effects on these outcomes will depend on who's providing the intervention, whether the intervention is at an individual level or a society-wide level, the context, whether it's rural or urban, the nature of the participants and their own characteristics in terms of education levels, socioeconomic status, all kinds of, intersecting vulnerabilities and whatever, lots of characteristics of the participants themselves will drive the outcomes, and whether these were standalone interventions or whether they were combined into bundled into packages of interventions. But so this is effectively what the evidence gap map was able to to kind of break down both these pathways and then the nature of the interventions and then the achievements and the outcomes. So those yellow and orange and then the green boxes are sort of key ones that we'll see later in terms of the results. So we can go to the next slide. And so this is just, again, a lot of boxes here, but the key ones to focus on really is just that through this filtering process, the PRISMA is preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which just basically gives a structure to what studies are included and excluded in a rigorous way. So, but the upshot here is there were 5,000 records identified in that top box, from the initial search, and then through various stages of screening and reporting assessments, what we get to in that bottom left box is the number of studies included in the evidence gap map after, all of these factors and making sure there no duplications, et cetera, gets down to 423. So there were 288 impact evaluations, 105 process evaluations, and systematic reviews. There were 38 of those, although some had would ticked more than one box. So yeah, down to 423 in total included in the actual evidence gap map. Okay, next slide. And this is just a distribution of the records to get a sense of, firstly, the geographic distribution. In that top left graph, we see it's predominantly Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where the studies were coming from. The top right one shows that most studies used a causal design to estimate the effectiveness of the interventions. So a lot of randomized control trials or non-experimental designs, but with a comparison group. And then in terms of the focus of the interventions, there were predominantly economic interventions, but there were also then capacity building, and then fewer on the gender awareness activities for social behavior change, support to civil society and community organizations, and then really very few on policy and institutional interventions. So next slide. Okay, again, in terms of then the outcome side of it, we see again that, predominantly there's a focus, or rather more on self-empowerment, economic and social empowerment, and then again, far fewer along the outcomes related to political empowerment. And then in terms of the capacity building interventions, life skills training were the ones that had the highest number of the studies, and whereas information and communication technologies had the least. And under self-empowerment outcomes, the highest frequencies were observed for economic interventions and the lowest for policy and institutional interventions. And similarly for social empowerment, the highest frequencies were for economic empowerment and lowest for policy and institutional interventions. So that gives a sense of the breakdown of those studies across those dimensions. And then if we go to the next slide, it's the actual evidence gap map visual here of, and not surprising based on those two previous slides that you see in both the top row around policy and institutional interventions, and then that those are far fewer of those, and then in the political and empowerment column in terms of the outcomes, there are far fewer of those, but where the evidence so far is most prevalent is around economic interventions, and then along outcomes of self-empowerment, social empowerment, and then a bit less under economic empowerment. So this the graph at the end gives a nice visual representation of where the evidence that exists so far is falling, and where the gaps really remain. And we see that policy and institutional interventions are most frequently combined with social empowerment and then self-empowerment. And gender awareness activities for socio-behavioral change interventions are most frequently populated with social empowerment and then self-empowerment. So obviously a lot of these things happening, interventions happening together, and outcomes that are where there's more than one outcome. And capacity building interventions, the support to civil society and community organizations, as well as economic interventions, are most frequently combined with self-empowerment, followed by social empowerment and economic empowerment. And interventions for supporting civil society and community organizations have been so far studied more from a qualitative perspective compared to the other interventions. So there's less quantitative evidence on those. So that's the end of the evidence gap map. I'll hand back over to Martin.
Thank you very much, Emily, for that great summary and presentation, and outlining the landscape of studies in the EGM is a great introduction to the systematic review. So through the EGM, we cast a very wide net, and we pull in this case, over 5,000 studies that we whittle down through the screening process of title and full text screening. And there were 2 reviewers that did each of those, and any disagreements were moderated by a third party. And then that landscape of studies was placed onto the intervention outcome framework. And then you've outlined very, very clearly the aggregated EGM, and an online version of that is available. And that's been posted in the chat. So please do have a look at that. And also you can unpack that aggregated map to look into the individual intervention types and outcome areas. And if you click on each of the intervention outcome combinations within the online EGM, you'll see the specific studies that contributed to the, which were located within that particular intervention and outcome cell. So the purpose of the systematic review is to focus on one or more saturated cells. So these are cells that have a sufficient number of studies such that we can aggregate effect sizes to understand whether the intervention works across contexts. And by doing so, by aggregating, we increase the sample size and by doing that, we decrease the confidence intervals, and we can make stronger claims around the effectiveness of that particular intervention type. So as we saw in the aggregated EGM map, we have a lot of studies in terms of economic interventions and in terms of capacity building interventions, especially across self-empowerment and social empowerment domains. And through our engagement with our advisory committee, so that included, for example, our own Sebleh Nagusi, as well as Naila Kabir, Shagun Sabharwal, Tabitha Mulyampity, and Marcus Goldstein, and we focused on life skills training to focus the systematic review on. And we did that for a couple of reasons. The first reason was that when we looked at the existing evidence, we found other reviews were focusing on economic interventions, and we wanted to focus more on a capacity building intervention type. So for example, the economic interventions in other studies were looking at, for example, cash transfers or loans. And so within our capacity building intervention type, we had a number of different sub-intervention types, including ICT interventions, business training and mentoring, technical and vocational training, but we had the most number of studies within life skills training. And we defined that as training to enhance life skills, which are the abilities for adaptive and positive behavior that enable individuals to deal effectively with the demands and challenges of everyday life. And when we looked into other systematic reviews, there weren't any previous reviews on life skills education interventions for the empowerment of women in developing countries, as other reviews were either different in scope or geographical coverage. For example, the 3 studies here, plus in addition, a study by Luamba and others from 3IE, which also focused on life skills training, but only in so-called fragile state environments. So we focused on that particular sub-intervention type. And next slide, please. And we did so looking across both self and social empowerment outcome areas. That was our primary objective. Our secondary objective was also to assess the impact and effectiveness of life skills training on economic and political empowerment areas, but our primary focus was on self and social empowerment. Next slide, please. So the first step was to then refine and screen again the studies that were within life skills intervention training, that sub-intervention type. So there we started off with 171 studies, but through the title and abstract screening and full text screening, this was whittled down to 36 studies that are included in the systematic review. And again, each time we had two different coders that were doing the data extraction and screening, and any disagreements between them were moderated by a third party. We also extracted wider characteristics of the studies, such as geographical codes, population, setting, study design, and so forth, which we included in the later meta-analysis. Next slide, please. So we encountered a number of challenges in related to the systematic review. So these included classifying outcomes in specific categories and the exclusion of irrelevant outcomes. At a very early stage in the review, we found that we had a choice. We could either screen studies in based on whether they focused on empowerment, or we could screen studies in based on the extent to which outcome areas focused on women's empowerment. And our decision within the review was to screen on outcome areas, but to do so in a very particular way. So for example, I'll give you two examples. One of these is on a wash intervention, a water sanitation hygiene intervention. So if that study, for example, focused on child health outcomes, we would screen that out because it wasn't focused directly on women's empowerment. However, if that study reported outcomes in terms of time savings for women, we would screen it in. Another example is if the intervention was on microfinance, if the outcome areas that were reported were on business performance, we would screen it out, we would not include it. But if the outcome areas focused on, for example, increased income for women, then we'd screen it in. So that's an example of some of the challenges we faced when selecting the studies for the full EGM and also for this systematic review. And we found the lack of common indices within the outcome areas for life skills training, such as the Women's Empowerment Index in Agriculture or the Project-Specific Women's Empowerment Index in Agriculture, which were the most widespread indices we found in the EGM. We didn't find these within this particular set of cells. And also we needed to make sure we were getting the direction of the effect correct. And sometimes that wasn't so straightforward when looking through the studies. Next slide, please. So here are the characteristics of the studies that were screened into the systematic review. So most of the studies were from Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia. Most of the studies focused on low and middle income countries, followed by low income countries, followed by upper middle income countries. And we have a nice geographical representation there of where the studies were located. Next slide, please. Most of the studies focused on rural areas. And here we see the particular sub-intervention types that were categorized in terms of the life skills training interventions. So most of the training focused on critical thinking skills, decision-making skills, as well as with a lesser degree of frequency, interpersonal communication skills and coping and self-management skills. Most of the studies were based on experimental evidence, and the critical appraisal of studies found that over most of the criteria there, the studies had either high or medium levels of confidence. However, due to the critical appraisal tool we were using, which essentially prioritizes the weakest link in the chain when assessing confidence, the overall confidence level of the studies that were included was low. Next slide, please. So here we have the effect sizes from the systematic review. So we can see the outcome areas in red, in green, in turquoise, and in purple. We can see the effect sizes, and we can see the number of studies, which is illustrated in terms of the different shapes that have been used. So in terms of self-empowerment outcomes, we found the greatest effect in terms of attitudes to gender issues, followed by leadership, followed by psychosocial well-being. In terms of social empowerment outcomes, we found the greatest effect from life skills training on sexual and reproductive health and rights, followed by access to social services, which was just significant. In terms of economic empowerment, we found significant and positive effect sizes in terms of finance and in terms of employment. And overall, we found an increase in life skills themselves, and which was the purpose of the training. Next slide, please. So how does this relate to the GCF and the GCF's gender work? Well, as you know, in decision B0911, the GCF adopted the Gender Policy and Action Plan, which was revised into the Gender Equality Policy. And this allowed us to move beyond the narrow understanding of gender to consider and respect the contribution of both men and women. And GCF's approach to mainstreaming gender requires a strong understanding of gender issues and capacity, and this isn't always immediately available within some of the entities accredited by the GCF. So importantly, the gender policy and the standards offers the possibility for additional resources and support for countries and entities in terms of gender training. So on the one hand, the gender policy sets out a commitment to measure the outcomes and impacts of activities on women's and men's resilience to climate change, which is critical. Next slide, please. But the gender policy and policy standards move beyond that. So that in the first instance, as we work through the standards, the Secretariat's able to organise gender training and capacity building for accredited entities and delivery partners. And this is through the RPSP. So we found in some of our previous evaluative work in the unit, especially in least developed countries, some of the accredited entities struggle to comply with the gender policy standards, and they don't necessarily have an in-house capacity on this. And when the accredited entity in one of those cases submits the gender assessment and gender action plans, there's potential there for enhancing the capacity in terms of gender within the accredited entity. And our previous evaluative work has highlighted a high degree of, a reasonable degree of variance in terms of the quality of gender action plans that have been delivered to the GCF, and that this varies across DAEs and international accredited entities. In our previous evaluative work, we've also highlighted that compliance with the gender policies is extremely high, and ensuring compliance can lead to some delays for the proposals. Importantly, the GCF is able to commit resources for independent verification and project reviews in terms of monitoring and reporting gender issues. And as APRs detail progress on gender action plans, the GCF is in a position to organise gender training and provide technical and material support for gender resources as requested by the board. And in that way, the GCF can complement its own technical capacity and with gender consultants or through the establishment of a gender advisory group of experts. So the takeaway from this foray through the EGM and through the systematic review is that through the systematic, we've found that life skills training works. It works for a range of self-empowerment outcomes and social empowerment outcomes, as well as economic empowerment outcomes. And the GCF is able to organise with the support of the board, or the GCF is able to request the board to organise gender trainings, and we would suggest and we would highlight that life skills training are, through this evidence gap map and through the systematic review, a very relevant area for GCF to explore in that regard, due to the increase in self-empowerment and social empowerment outcomes that have been covered. So thank you for your attention. It's very much a privilege to be able to present this alongside Emily, and on behalf of the considerable number of contributors to the evidence gap map from the Independent Evaluation Unit, from the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and also from the Campbell Collaboration. So on that note, I'll hand back to our moderator for today, Yonji.
Thank you very much, Martin and Emily, for that presentation.